Thank you for turning into Facebook Live to hear my story. My name is Ernie Heimann, and I am a Holocaust survivor. Before starting on my story, I'd like to do a little housekeeping matter. You are able to ask me questions by going through the chat box. I will answer all those questions at the end of my story. So be patient. I won't lose any of them, and I will answer them in the order that they were received. The other thing that I'd like to make clear is who the heck is a Holocaust survivor? Because we have survivors that run the gamut from those that were able to leave Europe before any of the problems existed, and others that had horrendous stories of survival in the camps and as hidden children and so on and so forth. I am a Holocaust survivor, even though I left Germany prior to the outbreak of World War II. The definition being any individual that left Europe between 1933, when Hitler came into power, and who survived the horrendous Holocaust. So you have a whole range of survivors. If you listen into these stories every week, you will find out the range that we have at the Holocaust Museum. So, without further ado, I was born in Mainz, Germany, and that is located about 30 miles west of the Frankfurt airport, which is one of the major airports in Germany. Mainz, as a matter of fact, is a old medieval town that was founded when the Romans moved up the Rhine to conquest Europe as it was then known, and then go on forth into Europe. So Mainz has been there for a long time, longer than Frankfurt, but Frankfurt being better known because of its airport, if you've traveled. So, born there on January 26, 1929. To make it easy for you, that makes me either 91 years old or 91 years young, whichever way that you want to look at it. When I was born, my family consisted of my father, my mother, who was fortunate enough to be a stay-at-home mom, and a brother about 8 years older than myself. The early years of my life were pretty uneventful. Hitler had not yet come into power. My father was in business, and we were comfortably living in our own apartment building on a street called Hindenburgstrasse, and which was located about a block and a half from my synagogue and my parochial school. What do I remember? I remember my brother having lots of fun, riding his big bike with his friends into the surrounding area, which consisted of hilly areas and areas where there were caves and embankments. And I always wanted to go with him. But of course, being 8 years younger, that wasn't much of an option. I finally thought I had licked when I obtained my first two-wheel bike. It was a 2-inch. It was a 20-incher, and as such, I thought, well, maybe my brother will take me with him on his excursion with his friends. My brother was very kind to me. He says, look, he says, you can come with us as long as you can keep up with us. Well, with his big 26-inch bike and my little 20-inch bike, there was no contest. 2 blocks down the street, and they were way ahead of me. So I reluctantly returned home, disappointed that I couldn't go with them. What else do I know? Well, I know that I was enrolled in a parochial school at my synagogue when I was 5 years old. And since it was just a block and a half down the street, I used to walk down to school by myself. The street was a very, very quiet residential street and had hardly any traffic. So it was easy enough for me to do that. Next, I guess, came the fact that in 1933, Hitler came into power and changes started to occur. First thing that affected me was that all of a sudden I couldn't play in the public parks anymore. I couldn't swim in the public swimming pools. And I was restricted from when I could go to the movie theater. Now, that occurred not only because I was a Jew, but I was a non-Aryan. And there we come into a very, very sticky situation, because the definition of Aryan was something that affected all kinds of people. And the idea of the Aryan master race was promulgated by Hitler. He patterned it after the Vikings that had conquered most of Europe in the Middle Ages. And according to him, in order to be an Aryan, you had to be of Scandinavian appearance. In other words, blonde hair, blue eyes, and Nordic features, white skin. So that left a lot of people in Germany that weren't of that appearance as non-Aryans, and also excluded from these very same activities that I was excluded from. And when you think about it, and you think about the society as it is today, lots of us would have been excluded. And when you think and you look back as an adult, you think, well, how ridiculous has this been? You look at some of the top Nazi leaders, including Hitler himself. They weren't Aryan in feature. They did not have Aryan features. And when I think about it, a lot of my family, particularly on my wife's side, had blonde hair, blue eyes, and very straight noses, etc., etc. So it just shows you what sometimes gets pushed and made into reality, when in all senses is not at all real. Next thing that, of course, occurred were additional racial laws. However, they did not affect me too greatly because, after all, I went to a parochial school. We had our own activities. We had our own intramural activities. I had all the sports and all of the athletics that anybody could have wished. But in 1937, another major blow was struck. And that was that a law was passed that no Jewish, and this is strictly Jewish, children could go to public school beyond 8th grade. Now, at that time, my brother was already in high school. And that meant that his high school education ended because there were no Jewish parochial schools in the higher grades. And a problem existed how to finish his education. Well, luckily for him and for us, we had a cousin living in Chicago who, when she heard of this problem, said, bring him over here, he'll live with me, and he'll finish his high school here in Chicago. So, in summer of 37, my father took my brother to Chicago, set him up with our cousin, and unfortunately decided to return to Germany. So from 37 on, there was a smaller family. I missed my brother, I missed his friends, but we existed nevertheless, my mother, my father, and myself. My schooling wasn't affected because I went to the parochial school. And however, other things had been happening during this period. The Nazis had disbanded all of the youth activities such as Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, 4-H clubs, anything and everything, and made the kids join what was then known as Hitler Youth. And this was an attempt to indoctrinate them in the Nazi principles. And unfortunately, they succeeded only too well. And what happened is these kids sometimes would act up. As a matter of fact, while my brother was still in high school, he would come home occasionally with a bloody nose, a black eye, and once even with a broken arm, all inflicted upon him by the bullies from Nazi youth groups. I tended to stay clear of them because I only had a block and a half to go from my school to my home. And I usually was accompanied by other kids or by parents who came to pick up their own children. So that was another hectic period in my life. However, like everything else, you make accommodations. And I didn't linger on my way home from school to home. So I kept myself pretty clean and free from these Nazi bullies. What was life like? Well, you know, you always do the best. You make accommodations. I remember that my father used to like to have beer, and you didn't have canned or bottled beer at the time that was readily available. So there was a tavern around the block, and he used to go down there. But with the Nazis acting up, it became uncomfortable. And so I, as a young kid of 7, 8, 9 years old, was enlisted to go to the tavern to get a pint of beer for him in his big mug. And I used to enjoy that. And very frankly, don't tell anybody, I used to take a sip every once in a while. The other thing that I did as a kid is my father was in the wholesale tobacco business. We also had a cigar factory, but his primary effort was to sell a variety of tobaccos. And our warehouse was in the back of the apartment building. And the packages that the tobacco and came in, was not as sealed as they are nowadays. And there used to be droppings of tobacco that used to drop onto the shelves. And I know that they used to sweep it up and put it into a big bag. And that bag was reserved for some of the less fortunate people that couldn't afford tobacco, and they would use it to smoke pipes. So as an 9-year-old, my gang of kids had the idea, well, why don't we smoke a pipe? So we had these pipes that we used to use to blow bubbles, and we decided it would be a good idea if I managed to get a hold of some of this loose tobacco, and we would smoke pipes. So that we did. Well, we got awful sick. And that was the end of the episode of smoking for us. Another thing is we had a cellar underneath our property that was rented out to winemakers. And this was another one of the episodes that I got into as a young kid. The cellars were open and allowed me to enter, and I made friends with the winemaker. They had big barrels in which they fermented the wine and until it became ready for sale. And I know that the winemaker used to go around and he used to sample the wine and spit it out. And so I used to go with him and he said, hey, would you like to have a little taste? So I said, okay. And in Europe at that time, wine was a beverage that was usually consumed with dinner. So, they didn't think much of it. And kids used to have a little wine at dinner time. So I used to go around with a winemaker and sample the wine. I didn't get drunk, so nothing serious happened, but I became a connoisseur of wine. Next, what I can tell you is that the next biggest thing that happened was, of course, Kristallnacht. Now, Kristallnacht occurred November 9th to 10th of 38. And this was really, really, really a tragic and traumatic event for all of people, Jewish people in Germany and Austria at the time. The events were not identical in each city. The only thing that was pretty consistent was that during that night, Nazi gangs vandalized Jewish houses of worship. That was pretty consistent in every community. And in addition to that, they vandalized all kinds of Jewish property. Stores were vandalized. Even private residences were vandalized and looted. And then to top it off, Jewish institutions were vandalized, firebombed. Even Jewish hospitals that serve the general population were vandalized and firebombed, some of them completely destroyed. Well, what happened to us? My father was away traveling. He used to travel extensively through southern Germany to sell the products from his wholesale operation. And he was away on a trip. Mother and I were at home. We had dinner. We went to bed. There was no such thing as TV or any of the mobile media that is present today. Yeah, we had a landline telephone, and we had a radio that would occasionally work. But that was all. So we didn't listen to anything. We went to had dinner, we went to bed, got up in the morning, had breakfast, time to go to school. So I put on my coat, put on my backpack, opened the front door, and I was amazed. That quiet residential street was full of people going down towards our synagogue. I quickly ran to the street. I asked, what's going on? They said, don't you know what happened overnight? The synagogue is on fire. Oh, as a 9-year-old, devastated, I ran back into the house, told my mother. She quickly put on her coat, and the two of us walked down towards the synagogue. And sure enough, it was a fire, as was my adjoining parochial school. Now, the firemen were there. They had their hoses at the ready, but they weren't spraying any water. I asked, what's going on? They said, well, they're here to make sure that the fire doesn't spread to adjoining property. Devastated as I saw my school, all of my work in that school, my little drawings and my essays going up in smoke, and my house of worship aflame. Well, devastated, my mother and I went quickly back to the house, locked the door, drew the blinds, and we turned on the radio to find out the news of what was happening all over Germany. Later that morning, we got a call from my father. He said he was somewhere in the middle of Germany. Friends had told him it would be inadvisable for him to travel home, and he was going to stay with them overnight. So we started to hunker down for the night. And about 8 o'clock, there was a knock on the door. Well, what do we do? We knew what was going on, had been going on throughout Germany. We had two options. We could either open the door and face whatever music would happen, or they would break down the door and enter in any case. So we decided to open the door, and on the doorstep was my father's younger brother. He said he had a little suitcase with him. He says, quick, let me in. So we let him in, we locked the door, and he told us his tale of woe. Well, he lived in a small town near Nuremberg in southern Germany. And that morning he had been tipped off by friends that the Gestapo, that's the German secret police, or Nazi secret police, were rounding up all males in town and sending them to a concentration camp. He decided quickly to pack the suitcase, skip out of the back door, get on a train and come to Mainz, hoping that it would be better here. Well, we were glad to have a man in the house. So we again locked the door, and we had dinner together, and we prepared and went to bed. Next morning, we heard from my father that he was on his way back to Mainz, and by around noon, he had arrived. And he was a changed man. Why do I say that he was a changed man? Well, for years, my father had the firm conviction that nothing would ever happen to him and his family. Why? Well, after all, he was a World War veteran, a front line soldier that had been decorated with the Iron Cross, which was one of the highest decorations that a German soldier could obtain. And he had told us constantly that don't worry about what's going on with Hitler. My fellow veterans would never allow anything to happen to me and to my family. Well, coming back to Mainz, he had seen what happened to his fellow Jewish veterans with their iron crosses who had been dragged from their homes, made to clean the gutters, and then shipped the gutters of the street, and then shipped off to concentration camp. And he realized that his hopes, his thoughts had gone to naught, and that there would no longer be any future for Jews in Germany. And with that in mind, he made immediate attempts to get us out of Germany. However, it was too late. There were loads of people ahead of him trying to get out of Germany. And, you know, it wasn't like it is today. When you travel in Europe, you go across from one border to the other, just like you would here in the States. In Europe at that time, every country had its borders sealed. In order to that country, you had to go through immigration. You had to have a permit or a visa. And they weren't issuing visas. And why was that? And again, you have to understand the history of the time. 1938, all of the world was still in the Great Depression. They had many of their citizens out of work, depending upon soup lines for food. And they were not at all interested in receiving or allowing to enter more individuals that would be competing for work and food with their own natives. So no place to go. No, even though we had a car, we could have driven very easily from Mainz into France or Belgium or into Holland. Nobody wanted us. Nobody would allow us to cross the border. So that was the situation after Kristallnacht. My school was burnt down. I had no school. My father couldn't really do business anymore because the Nazis told everyone don't do business with Jews. But luckily for me, the English Parliament, 1 week after Kristallnacht, passed a law that would allow 10,000 unaccompanied children into England. There were some provisos, but the provisos were very reasonable. Number one, the kids had to be unaccompanied. They didn't want the adults. They wanted just to give a safe home for kids from 2 to about 16, 17. And they had to have an individual in England that would put up a bond that would secure the English government from having to take care of the kids. In other words, a bond that the kids would be maintained by others other than the government. Reasonable enough. And the last proviso was that they had to have a place to live. So with that, the Kindertransport began. December the 1st, the first one left Berlin. It was the kids from the Jewish orphanage that had been firebombed and made uninhabitable. So they were the first to go to England. And every week thereafter, another group of kids went. And again, I was very fortunate. I had a maiden aunt, a sister of my mother, who had been visiting friends in England at the time of Kristallnacht. And she very wisely decided no way was she going to return to Germany. So she was there. She and her friends made efforts to get me onto a Kindertransport. They put up the bond. They found a place for me to live, and it was my maid aunt. She was living in a hotel room, so she couldn't take care of me. But she found an English family in a adjacent suburb to London. It was a suburb at the time, no longer is. And with that in hand, she was able to make provisions for me to come to England on a Kindertransport. And so it was that on my 10th birthday, I was notified exactly on my 10th birthday that I would be able to leave on a Kindertransport 1 week later from Mainz to England. Well, I had other ideas of my 10th birthday before Kristallnacht. I had been asking for a 26-inch bike, but with Kristallnacht and all the events that occurred, 26-inch bike became not so important, and nothing greater could have happened on my 10th birthday than the gift of leaving Germany on the Kindertransport 1 week later. So that found me on the train station in Mainz 1 week later. My mother and father brought me there. The organizers put a number around my neck to identify me. There were plenty of other kids in the station, but they were from the surrounding countryside. Nobody from my parochial school was there. Most of them having left earlier since their parents had made provisions to get on the quota list early. And there it was. Train comes in. My mother and father give me good advice of how to behave. They told me that they would be making every effort to join me as early as they would be able to get permission to travel to England, and put me on a train. I was assigned to a compartment because that's the way the trains are in Europe. They still are. I went to the window and I waved goodbye to my parents. And that happened to be the last time that I saw my parents. 10-year-old kid, what does he do on a train? Well, you know, we at the Holocaust Museum give the name to these volunteers that come forth to help people, upstanders. And they were upstanders. They happened to be Quakers. We know them here in the United States as the American Fed Service Committee, and they had received permission to accompany the kids to the border. Now, these were not Jewish people, but they decided that this was something that they wanted to do. So they organized the kids on the train. The older kids were made chaperones to take care of the younger ones. And yeah, there was a chaperone in my compartment. And the chaperone was a older gal, I was saying probably about 15, 16, and she kept us younger kids busy playing simple games, singing. And so the train went north, up the Rhine, stopping at various stations to pick up more kids. And as darkness was beginning to fall, we were told to be on our best behavior. Best behavior. Why the best behavior? Well, we were told that the German border guards were going to come up on board to examine us before we could leave Germany. Examine us for what? I thought that the Germans and the Nazis were happy to get rid of all of us. Yeah, there's another historical fact that you have to be aware of. Historical fact being that at that particular time, before the breakout of World War II, anyone could leave Germany. Nazis were willing to let everybody go, even people in the concentration camps, people in the jails. The only catch was that, number one, they had to have a country to go to. And of course, as I explained to you before, those borders were closed. So that wasn't much of an option. And the other option was, if you left, you had to leave all of your wealth behind you. You couldn't take out money or goods or jewels or any of that type. And that's what the border guards were coming on board. Well, luckily, none of the kids had any of that contraband, and we were allowed to cross the border into Holland. At the very first station, we were met by more volunteers, upstanders, that passed hot chocolate and cookies through the windows of the train. We were happy to receive it. Train went on north to the North Sea, to Hook from Holland, where the ferry that would take us to England would depart. More volunteers met us there, put us onto the ferry. We got assigned to bunks and we went to sleep readily. Well, good job, because it was before dawn that we were awakened. We were off the coast of England and we were told to prepare to disembark. Disembarkment was also handled by volunteers. Those kids that already had accommodations were put on a train to London. The other kids that didn't have accommodations yet were put on buses that would take them to converted summer camps in the south of England to await accommodations in England. Well, train gets to London. My aunt meets me. She takes me to the English family that was going to take care of me. Happened to be mother, father, boy my age, and a girl about 2 years older. I was enrolled in public schools, in religious schools. I started to get my footings there, and there I was, middle of the summer of 1939. I was pretty much in tune with what was going on around us, but war clouds started to appear. The English were very much afraid that if war broke out, the Germans, the Nazis, would be bombing England, particularly London, and possibly with poison gas. So everyone, from the youngest baby to the eldest senior, were issued gas masks. We were all told we would always have to have them ready. And in addition thereto, if war broke out, we would have to report to our schools, and the schools would be evacuated to the countryside. Well, that happened September the 1st. Suitcase in hand, school, went to class with our teacher. We marched to train station, put on a train, off we go. Place called Northampton in the middle of England. We were told this was where we were going to stay for the rest of the war. So the kids went off the train and with a teacher and local guide, went to find where we would be staying for the rest of the war. So we were assigned to a street called Agnes Road, and knocked on the first door, the first house, and said, "Mrs. Smith, the kids from London are here. You were going to take two. Here's two." And two kids went into that home. And that's how I found myself at 12 Agnes Road. Mrs. Swallow opened the door. She had room for three, so the three of us went into that house. Well organized by the English government. So Mrs. Swallow had room because her kids were older and they were all off in the military already. She was a very nice lady. Her husband worked in the local shoe factory, and she had never seen Jewish individuals before. She was a staunch English Protestant, Church of England, and she was very interested in hearing our story, hearing what our Jewish religion requires of us. And amazingly, did everything that she could for us. She made sure that the meals would be as compliant with our requirements as possible. She insisted and demanded that we go to religious services every Saturday, and also to go to religious school. Amazing, completely amazing. All right, so now here we are, a whole school of kids. What the heck are we going to do for schooling? English had it figured out as well. The younger kids went to a grade school, the older kids to high school. The way it worked is that the local kids would go to school from early in the morning to late at night, to late at noon, and the London kids from noon until late in the afternoon. And to make it fair, would be reversed every month. Well, you'd think there'd be some kickback. Well, I can tell you, very little kickback at all. As a matter of fact, the local kids invited us to join their Boy Scouts, their Girl Scouts, all of their activities. We had a ball on the weekends. We used to ride on our bikes in the countryside. And Boy Scouts went to camp outs, overnight camp. I was even designated to be the cook, and in deference to my dietary requirements, we had beef stew, and we had a ball from time I got there until the time I left, which was in September of 1943. I think those were some of the more happy times. I got accustomed to scrimping, I guess it was called, where we would go down the country lanes, and if there were apple trees or peach trees or whatever they were, and there was fruit hanging there, we would kind of sample it. So we had a ball, and as I say, those were some of the more happy times in my life. Yeah, I missed my aunt. I missed of course, my parents, and because of the fact that my aunt was German, they considered an enemy alien, and she couldn't travel. So because of that, I didn't get to see her except on the holidays when I went into London to see her. Mentioned September 43. And we have to go back to my brother, who, if you remember, came to the US in 37 to complete his high school education. Well, the outbreak of war kept him in the US. After Pearl Harbor, he volunteered and enlisted in the US Army Air Corps. And because of that, he received permission to bring his brother to the US September 43. My aunt put me on a train to Liverpool. Volunteers met me in Liverpool, put me on a boat that would take me to New York, where an aunt was to meet me, and my aunt was to put me on a train, the overnight train to Chicago, where I was to be met by my uncle and aunt with whom I was going to be staying. Well, everything is fine. I get on the boat. And the only kid on the boat, as a matter of fact, I guess the only civilian. The rest of the passengers were merchant seamen whose boat had been torpedoed off the coast of South Africa, and who were on board to come to the US to pick up a new ship to bring supplies to war-ravaged England. When they found that I was traveling alone, they told me that I would become their mascot. I should stick by them. And even though there had been no U-boat attacks, that if anything happened, they would know what to do and would take care of me. Well, all good. Well, we sailed around Ireland, out 3 days into the Atlantic Ocean, having been joined by about 300 other ships, steaming towards New York. All of a sudden, all heck breaks loose. A pack of German U-boats that had been inactive for over 6 months attacked the convoy, sank about half of the ships, and luckily we weren't hit. And if you want to know more about that, there are books that detail the submarine warfare in the Atlantic that are available. Anyway, convoy gets split into two. Our part went north to hug the coasts of Iceland and Greenland so that we would have air cover protection. And lo and behold, we end up in a place, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Yeah. What the heck is a 10-and-a-half-year-old kid that's supposed to be met by his aunt in New York do in Halifax, Nova Scotia? Well, if it wouldn't have been for upstanders, I'd still be in Halifax, Nova Scotia, I guess. But no, they met me at the boat, put me on a train to Montreal. More people, more volunteers met me in Montreal, put me on a train to New York. And lo and behold, I end up and my aunt meets me. So there I am. Now, remember, this was all done before cell phones, all of this stuff. Yeah, how did it get accomplished? Well, volunteers, telephone, landline, and Western Union. So then my aunt meets me, takes me to her apartment, feeds me a good meal, puts me on a train to Chicago. Uncle meets me, takes me to his home, enrolls me in high school. I ended up going to Lane Technical High School here in Chicago, graduated it in June of 1946. That time I wanted to join the army to try to find out what happened to my parents, because I figured they would get me to Europe. At the recruitment station, they laughed at me. They said, "Kid, don't you know? And everybody's being discharged. We're not looking for anybody to enlist. Go and do your thing, get yourself a job, go to school, whatever it is you have in mind." I was lucky enough, I got enrolled into Illinois Institute of Technology, ended up graduating after 4 years in June of 1950, got myself a job, got married in September, started a family, and pursued the American dream, except that 52, the draft caught up with me. And I was drafted for the Korean War. So I served by 2 years, got out, got my job back. And that's when we started the family and pursued the American dream further. And that brings me to today, 91 years old, having pursued my dream here in the United States, having fulfilled my abilities to the greatest amount, and grateful that this country has taken me in and allowed me to do that. So we're at the end of the story, and I skipped a lot of stuff. If you have questions, you can click on chat. And there I got what books, and they're the questions that are coming up. So I'm going to try to answer them. What books would you recommend for people who want to learn more about the Holocaust? There's such a multitude of books that I'm not about to recommend any of them. What you can do is you can go to, once the museum opens up, you can go over to the library there, and you can peruse hundreds of books on the Holocaust. It depends what you're interested in. If you're interested in individual stories, or if you're interested in factual information, lots and lots of stuff there. And the most important thing, above all, is that we learn from history. Because if we don't learn from history, we're going to repeat the same mistakes that we made years and years ago. If there's any other question, the other question is, why was it important for you to join? And what is the favorite part of your museum? Well, it was important for me to become a speaker at the museum so that I could relate what happened to a 10-year-old kid. And as far as what's the favorite part of the museum, I really don't know if I have a favorite part. Most of it is all sad. However, most hopeful, I think, what I find is most inspiring is the movie that goes on at the end of the tour through the exhibition, because it shows you that, unfortunately, the Holocaust is not the end of the story. We have many, many episodes where people right today, are being abused, are being killed, are being discriminated against, not having the freedom that we as human beings deserve. And I remind you, just look around what's going on today. And you have your answer. We have to look to the future. Janice, what would you say to encourage them to become upstanders, young kids? Well, all that I can tell you is you never know when somebody's going to bully you and why they're going to bully you. But I can assure you, there will be bullies, and you probably have met them. So all that you can do is you can grab a hold of one of the football players or one of the big guys in your group and say, hey, would you be my upstander? And usually they will, because it happened to me while I was in high school. And that's about it. In other words, remember history. Remember, it could happen to you. And therefore, you have to be your brother's keeper. If there's no other questions, I will conclude with just another remark. And I wish all of you the best. Stay well and keep up the good fight, because that's what we need. And go back in history, learn about what has happened, and make sure that it doesn't happen again. And by history, I don't mean just the Holocaust. Go back even further. And you'll see that we, unfortunately, have a short memory and will allow things to repeat and shouldn't be repeated. So do your best to make this a world that is safe for every human being, no matter what their color, what their religion, what their inclinations are. Just remember that we're all children of the same source and that we deserve to live a decent life. With that, God bless you.